Hello, and welcome back to Intentional Community Conversations with Intend Indiana. My name is Jeb Reece. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Intend, and I'll be your host today. Land banking is one of those topics that affects people a long time before they even know what land banking is. We've all seen that boarded up house on some street we drive by or we live on in our community. And in Indiana, more communities are asking what it takes to handle these properties in a way that's fair, effective, and sustainable. We're making this three-part series because it's a big conversation. Today, in part one, we're going to focus on Indiana, where land banking is happening, the challenges communities face when starting a land bank, and who needs to be at the table and how funding shapes what's possible. To help kick things off, I'm joined by Joe Fillenwarth, our land bank manager, Andrew Bradley with Prosperity Indiana, and Julie Halbig from the Uplands Regional Land Bank. Joe, let's start with the basics. What is land banking and why does Indiana need land banks?
So really, anyone can be a land bank, and being a land bank is just owning property. But when we're talking about land banking in our conversational context, we're talking about organizations that take vacant and abandoned properties in a way that will make them useful again. So this is turning those problem properties, whether they're vacant lots or boarded up structures, back into homes, businesses, or community spaces like community gardens. Um, and we're really talking about organizations that are formed under state statutes. So these are usually nonprofits that have a collaborative ethos with local government, whether that's city or county government. And the idea is to use those resources that the county and government can offer to revitalize some of these structures. So especially in the Midwest, we see a lot of towns that were affected by this greater uh, industrial flight from our communities, and they've left a lot of our neighborhoods underinvested. Um, and this is, not only placed costs into the people that live in those neighborhoods, but also on government going in and tearing down these homes and structures and trying to manage some of the maybe not as responsible investors that have taken over as homeowners have left the communities. So what a land bank does is kind of centralizes some of those uh, costs and also mitigates some of those externalities for the communities that actually live in those neighborhoods.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So really, it's this quasi-governmental entity that's specializing in returning these vacant and abandoned properties to productive use. So let's ground this in Indiana. Where are we seeing land banking take hold, and where is it still emerging? We've been working with different communities throughout the state, and we've seen established land banks in southern Indiana, the Uplands Regional Land Bank, Indianapolis, and then the Muncie Land Bank. We're seeing emerging land banks in the South Bend Elkhart region, as well as the eastern part of the state in Indiana. There are also some land bank programs in smaller communities, especially more rural communities like Blackford County and Henry County. And we're seeing more and more rural counties think about how regionalism could play in an approach. So we think about uplands, where it just makes more sense for smaller, more rural counties to join in this regional effort to combat vacancy and abandonment. So, Andrew, you work with Prosperity Indiana. You're a statewide organization, and you've been around as we've been workshopping some state legislation, state policy changes. How can you connect this to a statewide context? What's been tried before in regards to legislation, and how can current legislation or where we're at in this moment of regionalism and affordable housing is such a big topic of conversation. How is this different from the past?
Thanks, Jeb. And I'm here at Prosperity Indiana's office. We're the statewide association for community economic development. So a lot of our members are dealing with trying to increase housing and economic opportunity for all Hoosiers and their communities. And land banking has emerged as one of those tools. So not all of our members by any means are land banks, but several are. As the conversation about land banks has increased, it's become apparent that there are some policy levers that could be pulled to both improve the opportunities for land banks, their internal operations, but also for funding and for acquiring properties on which to build the housing and community resources that we've been talking about. So Indiana's land banks, the authorizing legislation came about in 2016, establishing the ability to form and incorporate those land banks. Around 2021, a group of land banks came together with the Center for Community Progress and put their heads together to see what were some of those legislative levers that could be pulled. And there were several different successive legislative efforts that were tried to either give options for counties to be able to provide some funding for land banks, either through some additional fees or percentage of property taxes paid, and also some of that internal operations work. Some of the bills, well, one bill in particular almost made it past the finish line, but I think what we found was that there's some reticence, especially among some local governments, to have to be forced to change the way that they operate in a specific way, to be told exactly what to do. Sometimes the legislation would have required properties themselves to be transferred over to land banks, or would have required counties to provide a list of eligible properties. And I think that's that requirement piece that we found has been a sticking point. So the conversation has been evolving, and I think improving that conversation has been happening. And Jeb, I'll turn it to you to describe what the most recent proposal has been.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I really think that through that process that you described, all these years of working with different land banks and working with state legislators, it's really about coalition building and incentivizing counties to want to start land banks. So how can land banks be a value add? So this most recent legislation that was workshopped at the State House was really around reducing the redemption period for vacant and abandoned properties in which counties were transferring tax deeds to land banks, or land banks were bidding on those tax liens at the treasurer's tax sale. So again, like really trying to be almost like an incentive for counties to participate, whereas counties aren't necessarily required to do anything. They may establish a land bank, so that local collaboration is definitely key and necessary as communities think about undertaking this work.
Thanks, Jeb. And if I could add one more thing about what makes this moment different, as viewers will likely know, in 2025, there was the big Senate Bill 1 that was passed that changes the structure of property taxes and really changes a lot of implications for local governments and how they fund services. And so it's been brought up that in the future, local governments are going to need to build their revenue by attracting residents. And so I think that's another mind shift that could work in land banks' favor, that land banks provide an option to be able to redevelop properties and be able to attract and keep residents in their communities. I think that's something else that could help shift some momentum towards land bank legislation.
Couldn't agree more. And especially as affordable housing and housing supply seems to be such a hot button issue in Indiana, really taking those, the lowest valued properties and providing an opportunity for them to be redeveloped for affordable housing and become a taxable asset for counties is another value add we see. So Julie, you work at the Uplands Regional Land Bank, or you've been working with the Uplands Regional Land Bank, and they're still relatively new land bank, but you've gotten this unique perspective of what it takes to get a land bank up and running. Y'all had some Ready $1 that like went towards like the initial launch of the land bank. So what, from your experience, do communities underestimate when they're getting started with this work?
No, thanks, Jeb. And yes, I'm a board member on the Uplands Regional Land Bank. We serve 5 rural counties of Davies, Greene, Lawrence, Crawford, Orange, and Martin. So if you're familiar with your Indiana geography, you know that those are indeed smaller or rural counties. And so I would say two things that you can underestimate when starting a land bank, which is exactly what you said, which is you need those seed or startup funds to probably at least get you through 2 years of operation. And that's one, to get all the proper legal setup, but also just by a function of how the state statute works for tax sales. By the time you purchase the first homes or parcels, and then are able to take possession of those actual properties, you're already a year into it, and then you need to account for some time to either rehab the property or building structure, and in some cases you will maybe have to face demos. So then you're already almost a year and a half in before you may be able to turn around and sell some property that you purchased initially as the land bank and get it back into the churn of first sale, so that you can start creating some cash flow for the land bank. So that's one big thing, is just giving yourself that time and enough startup funds. And secondly, what we really underestimated was how each property we purchased through a tax sale or a commissioner sale was going to be so very unique. We thought we'd start seeing some kind of duplication or trends of properties that we purchased. And while there is some uniformity in the overall process, of course, because based on state statute, it really does take a lot of investigation and phone calls and just researching, in advance of potential properties that might be a good fit at the tax sale. And then oftentimes, if you know your local assessor or the county commissioners, you may be able to get some of the backstory on certain properties. How likely are they to be redeemed or purchased even before or I should say, be made whole before the tax sale even comes up, and so therefore they may come off the tax sale. So it's just little things like that that really do take time, and eventually we know we'll start to see some trends and duplication of different properties we purchase, but that was a very surprising thing to all of us, both on staff and board.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Each property is unique, and I mean, these are problem properties, right? That the land banks are addressing, and it's a testament to the land banks' work that they're able to actually take these properties that have probably been a nuisance for 4 or 5+ years and eliminate those issues, whether they be legal, physical, and then eventually get them back to productive use. So definitely applaud all the work you guys are doing in Upland. And I definitely want to come back to the funding conversation in a minute. But okay, so Uplands, the land bank is established. Joe, from an operations side, what and who needs to be at the table to keep those properties moving from like preventable deterioration back to productive use?
Yeah, on the front end, I mean, a big one is a relationship with the county, a strong relationship with the county, making sure that properties that are going unsold in the county tax lien sales, that are most likely vacant and abandoned, are able to be transferred over to the land bank. A lot of the times in some of these communities, we'll see properties that'll cycle through the tax sale, as Julie kind of alluded to, where maybe they'll be on the tax sale 5 or 6 times and nobody's claiming them. And each time the structure will get a little bit more deteriorated and the tax lien will go a little bit up. So it's becoming more and more expensive to remediate, and it'll become a bigger and bigger problem for the community. So if the county is willing to partner with the land bank and take that off of future tax sales, put into the land bank's inventory, then the land bank can start to focus on those legal and physical issues. Secondly is partnerships with cities and municipalities. So code enforcement is a really big one. A lot of the times, if a land bank is privately purchasing a property, they're going after the worst properties. And a lot of the times these properties will have city liens, whether it's old demolition liens, failure to board, weed liens, all sorts of crazy stuff can pop up on there. And what a land bank is trying to do is not to hold on to that property, but to get someone to develop it and put it back into productive use. And so if code enforcement is willing to help the land bank to get rid of some of those liens, or to help, the land bank, if they're going by the property anyway, if code enforcement's going by to monitor the neighborhood, they might say, hey, someone was trying to break into this house. They can like coordinate with the land bank to make sure that the house stays in as good of a shape as it can be in. Those are the big ones, is the partnerships with local government, but then also, neighborhood-based community engagement. So staying up to date with neighborhood politics and where neighborhood leaders stand on certain problem properties that might not be in the tax lien sale or might not be on code enforcement's radar, but could be a key property within a neighborhood. Those are the three big ones, in my opinion.
Okay. And you talked a lot about partnerships. It seems like collaboration is really a key point in moving this work forward. Andrew, from a system standpoint, where have you seen partnerships really break down the most, and what fixes it? And I guess this could be from like a policy standpoint, or just really from the idea of moving something forward.
Yeah, I think especially working with land bank partners on policy and advocacy, I'd say that these systems, they break down wherever there is not familiarity and education and trust and mutual benefit. So if there are points between partners that need to be interdependent where you don't have those things, that's where you see that breakdown. And in some of the examples that we talked about before, with legislators, there can simply be that they're just not familiar with what land banks are, how they operate, how they can benefit communities. But what those legislators may know is that there's a lack of housing affordability in their community, or that there are visible, vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties, or that their communities are struggling with a new property tax scheme. And so that education and that building trust and showing that there is mutual benefit can help repair or build those initial bridges. And conversely, when we're thinking about ways to be able to fix that, sometimes it can be counterproductive and we found this, to try to find a one solution, a statewide solution for where individual relationships need to be the starting place. So even as we're looking at potential legislative strategies for the future, the way that we're going to move that forward is to have those who are involved in land banking build those individual relationships and find champions among their legislators. And from there, that's how we're going to be able to spread these ideas within the Indiana General Assembly, and then to be able to make that systemic change.
Okay, yeah, and keeping with this theme of partnership in the conversation and coalition building, Julie, the Uplands Regional Land Bank oversees a very large service area. What is one coordination habit that you've seen that has helped to make your regional model work? How do people in Daviess County end up working with people in Martin County?
Well, I think, from a very basic standpoint, is you just have to have even a fundamental collective agreement, foundational agreement that there is indeed a blight problem, and that this is just one of maybe a couple of different strategies that the more rural counties and communities can address through land banking. And so I think it really shows that the county and community elected officials are, being proactive and addressing a problem with a solution. And so, I think that was just foundational and necessary, that, there was a problem, we needed a solution. This is one way we can all come together and really work. And so we had each county passed an interlocal agreement with the land bank. They contribute $5,000 annually. Again, everybody has skin in the game. Everybody has representation on the board. So that's the kind of coordination, input, working together. And then I think kind of going to Andrew's point about mutual benefit, we wanted to start with some early wins. And one of those things that I think is unique to the land bank solution is many times it is only a land bank that can really turn around these long time blighted properties. Sometimes it may be residential, sometimes it may even be commercial, but the land bank is uniquely the entity that can come in and in many cases clear the lot or land parcel out, doesn't even need to be rebuilding or rehabbing a structure, just simply cleaning the lot up and then making it enticing enough to have a private buyer want to buy the empty lot from the land bank. Just that cost savings from the land bank, clearing the parcel, demoing anything that just cannot be salvaged. But we had some great early wins on that of, in talking with our countywide and local officials that, hey, boy, this would be a big signal to the community that if we could even get this parcel that's been sitting there causing problems, bringing down a neighborhood or a city block, those send big signals. And those can be just even a few of those in a rural community means a lot because it is in a smaller area.
Okay, yeah. And again, like I see the recurring theme of partnership, coalition building. And I want to go back to a point you made earlier about funding, because everything we've been talking about really depends on that funding resource, right? When people hear land bank, they hear the word bank. And unfortunately, the work we can't fund the land bank just by the sale of properties. Like you said earlier, really, we need that upfront sort of investment to get this really unique, impactful programming started. So I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about funding, and really want to hear from each of you around like how you see funding working, and how funding is so important to land banking. So Joe, I'd like to start with you.
So funding really becomes important on the organizational management side of things. So a land bank has staff, and that staff is there full time to manage this process and to think about blighted and abandoned properties and bringing them back into productive use. But also a land bank has a lot of costs when it comes to legal costs with these properties. A lot of the times when people think of vacant abandoned properties, they're just thinking about the physical characteristics of these properties. But as we kind of mentioned earlier, there can sometimes be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal costs tied into these properties, which make it very unpreferable for a developer to come in and develop it privately. There might be a lot that's only worth $2,000 on the private market, but it has $15,000 in liens attached to it. So it's actually got a negative property value. And what a land bank does is it'll work with local government to clear those, but sometimes there's different costs with title companies, making sure that the lots are insured, making sure that they're mowed, making sure that quiet title action is paid for, which is some of the action that can get rid of some of those liens. And then there's stabilization and maintenance. So sometimes a land bank will acquire a property that needs torn down and they're just unable to save it. And that costs money. Stabilizing properties that are savable also cost money. And so those are just lots of costs that will add up over time. And really, at the end, it's a net benefit because the public is going to see increased tax base, stronger communities with newer developments and rehabilitated developments, additional historic preservation, and they won't have as many of those missing teeth with the vacant lots and deteriorating properties in the middle. But that's just an investment the land bank has to come up with to make sure that happens.
Okay, and that's really what the funding is going towards, the actual programming. So Andrew, how does sustainable funding and policy design intersect?
It's really an important question because, especially when it comes to advocacy and working with lawmakers, anytime that you have funding involved, it's a much bigger challenge to get a request for state dollars, especially. So something that's really been important, even in the new approach to land bank legislation that Jeb, you talked about earlier, is finding ways to frame part of the policy ask in terms of savings, in terms of the financial benefits that it could have. So even something as small on paper as reducing the amount of time that it takes to redeem tax sale properties, we've been able to make some progress in creating scenarios to describe that reducing that time could be the difference between having a piece of property remain vacant during the harshest part of winter. If you can keep the pipes from bursting, then Joe's going to be able to go in and be able to save that property a lot easier than if we don't. And that comes from a policy ask, not necessarily a financial ask. However, if you're thinking, big picture, at some point, the question of resources for land banks is going to need to come back up. There's going to be a need to be able to make that ask and point to what some other states have been able to do in terms of being able to either provide a state appropriation for land banks or to find a way for other resources to be able to flow through to land banks. But what we're doing right now is building relationships, seeing can we improve the policy pathways. And by doing so, that is going to bring more partners in. And then hopefully we're going to be in a place where you have a really robust infrastructure of partners to be able to make that larger ask. And so, Jeb, if I could, let me turn it back to you and to our other partners. What would it take to make this type of progress scalable across Indiana?
Yeah, I think we look at our neighbors in Ohio and Michigan. They have very robust land bank legislation where the state is funding a lot of the work through a very intricate tax recapture structure, and so basically incentivizes the land banks to return these properties to productive use. But right now, as it stands, and also just as a way to we need to confront this issue of vacancy and abandonment immediately. We can't necessarily wait for state funding. We've seen community foundations, other philanthropic entities playing the role to kind of fill that gap. We've also seen counties themselves and cities come together to collaborate. And like Julie said, each of the counties in the Uplands Regional Land Bank contributes $5,000 annually to to make the land bank a reality. And so, Julie, just to wrap out the funding discussion, what are the realities of funding as it relates to maybe a rural setting, a regional setting?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jeb. I think, like I said, we were fortunate at the time in the spirit of regionalism, of which READY is a big component. We used READY 1 funds for that startup funding. But I think you bring up a great point about every county in Indiana has a county community foundation. And there are other philanthropic foundations throughout the state that I know have helped with kind of that seed funding, if you will, to get various land banks off the ground. And there are other ways too, beyond the tax sale process, in which land banks can acquire property. Obviously, a land bank can acquire privately foreclosed properties from banks. Sometimes there's private sales of properties to a land bank. In many cases, a municipality or even a local nonprofit may donate property to the land bank. So again, there are other ways for land banks to acquire property that they can then either rehab or turn around and sell to start getting some of that cash flow into the land bank. But I will tell you, one of the things too that I think we're still in a little bit of our discovery investigatory phase as a somewhat new regional land bank is, what are some different business models for land banks that we may need to consider? Quite honestly, we've been very focused on only residential parcels, but there's other land banks that do look at commercial parcels. And so that might be something that we need to consider more closely. But again, as you said, in Ohio and Michigan, there's other good models for all of us to look at, and how they keep, in the black, if you will, and keep that organizational, stable, steady cash flow coming into the land bank, so that they can keep doing what they do best, which is turning those abandoned and vacant properties around and getting them back on the tax rolls.
Yeah, thank you. And even just to wrap up this funding conversation, like I hear collaboration and partnership again, right? Like no one is funding the work by themselves. Like it's multiple layered approaches to funding. And it really goes back to that partnership to make it happen. Julie, Joe, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to all of you for joining us today as we got a little bit of a clearer vision on land banking here in Indiana. This was part one of our special 3-part series, and we hope that you learned something useful today. Next time, we're taking a quick step back to look at national best practices, what works, what doesn't, and what we can learn. Then we'll wrap the series up by coming back to Indiana with a deeper dive and updates on what's next. As always, thanks for listening to Intentional Community Conversations with Intend Indiana. You can find us online at www.intendindiana.org. Thanks.